More than 100 bodies lie here, named and unnamed, the unrescued. Without that fierce angel of humanity within us that risks all to save a fellow human's life, my father would have been here too. For many years, like other survivors and rescuers, my father, Hank Strauss, couldn't bear to tell their stories. We tell them now with deep gratitude to the people of St. Lawrence and Lawn.
Well, I tell you, it was one of these terribly windy nights. It was, blowing a gale of wind, and it was sleet and snow. It was really a nasty, dirty night.
I'll never forget the day. Because you couldn't see your hand in front of you, but snow. The wind's probably blowing 100 kilometers, and that kilometer then was 100 miles an hour then.
Quonset huts blew down in Iceland. We were on our way to Newfoundland, and we had winds of 85, 90 miles an hour. Seas that were up to the bridge wing, which were 40 feet. At 4 o'clock in the morning, we hit 200-foot cliffs with both destroyers and the supply ship, with this tremendous crash.
I woke up at 4:45 in the morning approximately and found the hull. We had just hit the rocks. And some guy came yelling, "Hey, Bergeron, get out of the sack. We just went aground."
Suddenly, the Pollux, it was picked up, lifted, and smashed against the rocks.
I jumped out of the sack and I ended up in the water up to over my ankles.
There was only one possible way of survival, and that was for these people to swim against the current under rough conditions and through oil for the last 50, 60 feet.
There were young boys, like 19, early 20s. They were so frantic. And, when you cry for your mom at that age, right? And they knew that, they probably weren't going to be saved or rescued. And a lot of them didn't, right? They'd jump in the water, but they'd be washed away.
He was 2 months shy of his 21st birthday. With little or no information provided by the Navy, the family never really learned the true story about what had happened and how Bo actually died.
We knew we were in the midst of war, but everything was happening over there. You knew the people were losing their lives and all these tragic things were happening. But you didn't expect something like that to happen right on your own shore. So many sailors clamoring for their lives and men trying to save them and rescue them. And some of them having them so close to saving their lives, and then a big sea would pull them away. You'd have lived through it, really, to realize just how touching a story it was.
Back in the day, in the 40s and that, Newfoundland was really in a hard shape, financially and all that. And they had gone through another war, they're into another one, plus the Depression, the tsunami that hit and wiped out the inshore fishery, and all this kind of stuff. So they were very poor.
There is a unique bond in this little town. I think a lot of it goes back to the hardships of the dirty 30s and an industrial mine diseases here.
They did fishing and gardening and kept animals. That's the way we kept alive back then. And so they were tough. There was an inner toughness within all of those men that made them go down there and do whatever they could for whoever was there.
I'll never forget the morning leaving the little apartment in Greenwich Village with my sea bag over my shoulders. I was then a first-class seaman.
It was unlike any other ship in the Navy, but that's the difference between the Pollux and, well, it had to be two other ships, the 1st, the 2nd, and 3rd Division. We came from the 3rd Division. I knew your dad, and I knew Tommy Turner. We were in the rifle team together for 5 or 6 years. We were all New Yorkers.
On our last trip, which was February after Pearl Harbor, we left Casco Bay in Maine and suddenly found we had 2 destroyers escorting us. First time we ever had an escort. We couldn't figure out what was going on. To this day, I still don't know what was going on.
February 17th, 1942. Soon after America's entry into World War II. 2 U.S. Navy destroyers, the Wilkes, the convoy's flagship with recently developed radar on board, and the Truxtun, an old World War I IV Piper, are assigned to escort the supply ship Pollux to the naval base in Argentia, Newfoundland. They maintained strict radio silence as they approached Torpedo Junction, where German U-boats prowl the North Atlantic.
We were zigzagging with the 2 destroyers because there was a wolf pack in the area, and I imagined they were in the area looking for us.
The flagship Wilkes takes its last star sighting on Antares, but wrongly records it as rising west rather than east of the meridian.
After a couple of days, we hit a very bad storm, and we had winds of 85, 90 miles an hour, seas that were up to the bridge wing, which were 40 feet, hail, snowstorms, no sights.
The convoy's crossing of the 50-fathom line around St. Pierre Bank is critical to their navigation plan. Any mistake in timing could put them dangerously off course.
Some minutes after 12, they arrived at the 50-fathom line on the St. Pierre Bank. And they weren't supposed to arrive there until about 1:30 in the morning. There was a communication problem between the officers on the Wilkes. Apparently, you know, the navigator wasn't notified, the commanding officer, the escort commander, none of them were notified that, look, something is not right.
Commanders on the flagship Wilkes are unaware they've crossed the 50-fathom line 90 minutes ahead of schedule. While their inexperienced crew logs the readouts, they never make it up the chain of command. With land ever closer, the commanders don't realize that the cold and ice have compromised the accuracy of their radar system. On the Pollux, Navigator Lieutenant Grindley already suspects the worst.
So he kept saying, you know, we're lost. Sir, I cannot tell you where we are, but I know we're in a nor'easter, and I think we're being blown to the west, which means we're going to miss that very narrow inlet that would take us up to the naval base.
Our navigator was ex-merchant marine and had been going to sea since he was 18, and he had been nervous the last 12 hours about our position. He kept indicating to the captain he thought we were maybe standing into danger on this course. He said we should break off and steer 90 degrees out now. The problem was that while I'm sure the captain had a lot of faith in the navigator, because he could navigate with a string and a weight, if he breaks off and they don't get in trouble, his career's finished. If he breaks off and the other ships get in trouble, his career isn't all that good anyway. So there was a lot of hesitancy, and the lead destroyer had radar, which was relatively new at the time.
In 1942, people didn't believe in radar. What's that? Reports came to Kelsey and to Webb, who was the squadron commander, Commodore, that something was on the radar screen. They checked the message file. There were no ships in convoy, so therefore it was not ships. And the other possibility was land, and they're not near land, so therefore it can't be land. You know, the range is reported 5,000 yards, 4,000 yards, 3,000 yards, 2,000 yards, 1,000 yards. Bang. On the Truxtun, of course, our concern was probably first for ourselves and our ship. Then the concern was, what about the other ships? Are they standing into danger?
So between the senior officer giving a position that's 30 miles off from where our position was, and the concern about breaking off, we stayed on, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, just like the navigator had said, all three of us ran into the cliffs and headlands.
I was asleep, and I got bounced out of my bunk. A lot of bunks got thrown off their little catches, and I ran up topside. First impression, what a hell of a mess.
Miles from the Truxtun, out on the barren rocks of Lawn Point, the Wilkes breaks free, but the Pollux is already aground. Keeping the Pollux in sight, the Wilkes stands by but is helpless to assist, frustrated by the winds and the raging seas.
The noise below, the lights and everything went out, the sirens took off, all sorts of things. I ran up to go to my watch station and saw only 100 yards or so from me, white cliffs, and realized that we had gone aground. And aground with 30-foot seas, picking us up and dropping us down. We don't know where the Truxtun was.
About 4 o'clock in the morning, the USS Truxtun, grounded in this cove, and the commander certainly was on the bridge and ordered that all engines be put in reverse. And certainly what happened was the tail enough, or the fan tail of the Truxtun, was drove between those two highlands, or those two islets, and the ship lost its propeller and rudder, and certainly the ship was disabled. The sailors never felt like they were in danger.
My first reaction was to laugh, because I was a sailor, and a sailor in a sailboat, one of the worst things you can do is run aground. Here I am in the Navy on this big ship with these guys who were trained for 4 years plus going to sea for God knows how long, and all of them with radar, and all of them ran aground. But it was only when I turned the searchlight on the cliff and saw this white, towering, slick thing, I realized that this might be more dangerous than I thought it was.
The Truxtun was unable to get off the rocks that she had run up on. And so they decided to abandon ship. When they decided to abandon ship, some guys volunteered to get in a little raft. They had these sort of canvas and K-pop life rafts on the ship, and they used those to try to get to the beach and take a line to the beach.
Less than 100 yards from shore at Chambers Cove, the sailors on the Truxtun are desperately seeking a way to safety.
The first two guys went over, and they brought a line over, and they dragged a hod over, and they tied it around a great big rock on the beach. And then me and two other fellows got into this life raft. The three of us took the life raft, and we pulled ourselves in on the beach. Probably took us about 7 or 8 minutes to get to the beach.
Ed Bergeron, a sailor who grew up in such deep poverty that he suffered rickets as a child, makes it to the beach. But he faces 300-foot frozen cliffs on every side.
As soon as I got on the beach with these other three guys, the first thing we thought of, hey, let's get off of here and see if we can go up and get some help somewhere. So we saw what we thought was a fairly decent incline, and that's when we tried to climb up that thing. And It was covered with ice and snow. It's the only way you could get up, so we managed to make the top of the cliff. When I got near the top here, it was got rougher because we couldn't use our fingers anymore, you know, or anything. So it was just knees and elbows and elbows. When I got to the top, I helped these other two guys get on top of the cliff, and we looked over in the distance. We could see a little shed. And then I helped Peterson over, and I'm trying to figure out where that shack was. It's somewhere to the right of here. So I told the guys to stay there and stay warm, and I'd go out and see if I could find some help somewhere. So after about a mile and a half or so, I happened to see a little bit of smoke in the horizon, and went over, ran in towards the direction of the smoke and come to this mining shack. I ran over there, and these guys were out in the yard looking at me, wondering who I was, where I come from, or what, you know?
There was a snow, fairly heavy snow. Out of it came this guy toward them, and one of the men who were with them, his name was Mike Turpin, he saw him and went over, because it was a very unusual thing, to 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, 6:30 in the morning. So he went over to him and found out what he was doing.
I told him, I says, we have a shipwreck on the beach up there. I've come to see if somebody can give us a hand.
So I dropped the axe, went down to this guy and brought him up and put him in the mine shack there and told the boys to ship ashore in cove over. He didn't know which cove, but after I got over part of the ways, I said, the gentleman was going with me still later, I said, it's not in Saco, we got to be in Chamber Cove. So that's where we headed for. We went up over the top of the ridge and looked down, here she was.
The men from the mine and from St. Lawrence, from the town of St. Lawrence, got out there and saw what was going on. Being fishermen for generations and knowing their waters, they knew what to do. And so they organized a rescue effort.
Gus Etchegary was just 17 at the time. His father was mill manager, and his older brother Theo was a chemist for the mine. He's the one man alive who can tell the story as he lived it that day on the beach at Chambers Cove.
The mine captain, Rennie Slaney, ceased all operations in the mine, and the men went right away to the site. In the meantime, my father called me and said, get your bum down here as fast as you can in the truck and collect as many ropes as you can along the way from various people.
The mine was closed down, and all the miners certainly came out here, and for the better part of the day, they were involved in rescue operations on the beach.
Probably 150 to 200 people from the mines, because, as I say, they were changing shifts. So everybody was available, and when they saw this man with his story about where he was and what happened, of course, they came as quickly as they could.
At some point in one of the rafts that did actually make it before the line snarled and then they could not use it anymore, and they couldn't use the rafts anymore, my uncle, Bo, got into one of those rafts and went to the beach with an officer who was sent there to coordinate the rescue attempt. And he goes over as a signalman to be able to communicate back with the ship.
So here was the vessel that I saw when I came over the hill, lying on her side, partially submerged, and from the stern to the head, to the bow, men were clinging on to the railing.
Some were partly naked, you know, exposed to that cold. And as the seas would break over that ship, there'd be a couple, 2, 3 less when the sea, you know, straightened out where you could see again.
I was there, and my father said to me, don't come near here, but he said, you can do something else worthwhile, and that is see if you can build a fire. So
the guys on the ship were hesitant. They did not want to swim for it, and they kept asking for boats. And Bo was instructed to tell the captain on the ship that they could not get boats out there, and that according to the locals who were there rescuing them, they needed to swim for it.
The rescuers, with, as I say, ropes around them, are going out in the water and trying to encourage the sailors as they approached and made it, you know, within 30, 40 feet to continue to swim and try to make it in through that oil and rough water and all the rest of it. And, you know, I can see today in my mind's eye, you know, some of these sailors getting in so far and the waves taking them back out, and, you know, again, like this. And finally, you see maybe a man sticking his hands into the beach while the water receded, you know. It's, you know, that kind of image is not something you see every day in a week.
Fighting the wind and the freezing ocean spray, the rescuers run their ropes down to the beach and, tying themselves to survivors, carry the oil-soaked and battered sailors up the 300-foot vertical cliff to safety.
I mean, that was a major undertaking, getting, you know, people who weighed 150 or 200 pounds in some cases up that cliff.
Far from the wreck of the Truxtun at Chambers Cove, at just about dawn on that cold and stormy morning, teenagers Dolph Jarvis and Ken Roll were hunting birds on the point at Weber's Cove. From this remote distance, through the clouds and sleet, they saw what they believed to be the lights of a ship off the cliffs at Lawn Point. They trekked 2 miles into the town of Lawn to tell the men there what they saw.
And they ran into my father, and they told him that there was a ship ashore on Lawn Point, and that they could see the water between the ship and the land there. So anyway, he sort of disagreed with them. He said because of the nature of the morning, he told them that he didn't think they could see a ship at the time.
As you can see, it's difficult to see Lawn Point today, right? You know, there's still some, you know, there's a bit of haze in that, so you can imagine how lucky they were to see the boat, for that storm to lift enough at the time for them to see it. And you could see why my father and them would, you know, tend to disbelieve it.
A phone call from St. Lawrence to Lawn confirms that a ship had grounded in Chambers Cove. Rescuers there had seen an oil slick coming from the direction of Lawn Point. Could it be that there was another ship aground?
A group of men got together. Joe Manning, Alfred Grant, Tom Connors, Jimmy Drake. They got some ropes together and horses and sleds, and away they went. They didn't bring any food with them. They just went and they were gone till the next day sometime.
It would be a rugged 10-mile trek from the town of Lawn to the cliffs at Lawn Point, not knowing if there was anyone to be found there. Meanwhile, out there on a precarious ledge, the sailors on the Pollux are running out of time as the ship succumbs to the pounding seas.
So then all of a sudden I see a crack forward of the bridge and after the forward king post, and the whole forward part of the ship, as the crack got wider, suddenly was picked up, lifted and smashed against the rocks, with all the cargo and everything pouring out of the open holes that were now open to the sea.
The Pollux sailors are trying to get a line to what seems like a nearby shore. Navigator Grindley tosses a heaving line that grabs the rocks with a grappling hook, but is neither strong enough nor stable enough to get the sailors all the way to the rocks.
I grabbed a hold of that line, which was actually the line from the boat to the ship, and I started to pull myself in on that line. Well, I got about maybe 10 feet pulling myself in. A big wave picked me up, pulled me right off the line. I couldn't hold on to it.
I had been a diver in college, so I realized that if I could go over on the line hand in hand, it might save my life, along with others. All of a sudden, I was carried down, I don't know how far, but well below the surface. And I couldn't move. the water was freezing. I couldn't move my arms, I couldn't swim, I couldn't do anything, and I knew I was going to just drown. And all of a sudden, I felt the chin of my life jacket start pulling my head, and the life jacket pulled me up to the surface. And I started yelling, you know, "You bastards, for God's sake, pull me in, pull me in." And what had happened is that they were pulling on the rope, the four of them, and all that happened is their hands were slipping on the rope because of the bunker oil. So I would have drowned, and I would have died there, except that the coxswain, Wiltrout, had brains enough to make himself a winch. And he put the oily rope around his waist a couple of times, and the other three guys turned him like a winch. And that's what got me up the side of the, 30 feet probably of the ship, and saved my life. When the whole bow broke off, the captain said, "Anyone who wants to abandon ship."
Once you hit that water, it was a horror story. As a matter of fact, that's what killed a lot of the guys. These waves are coming down like you wouldn't believe. And pretty soon it was full of fuel oil. And it took the white caps off the wave, but all you had was a big dirty waves with big globs of oil in it.
And you could just see people floating with their hands up in the air like they were surrendering because they didn't have their life jacket tied. And the life jacket, as the cold hit them and they couldn't move, the life jacket would come up and smother them and pull their hands up like this. And a couple of guys were washed up.
Rose and I just jumped over the side. So there's DeRose and I trying to get out in these oil slippery rocks. And I gave DeRose a little push, and he reached down to help me up because it was tough. Well, DeRose didn't have any clothes on. All he had was a pair of dungaree pants and a T-shirt and a life jacket. Then I had this knife, and I chopped the handholds in the cliff, and we climbed up.
Greenfield, his buddy DeRosa, and Jack Garnos head out to find shelter and help. Meanwhile, Alfred Dupuy, barefoot and frostbitten, makes his way to the ledge, hoping to connect the ship to shore. Lionel Saint, following the oiled slick he'd seen at Chambers Cove, comes upon Garnos, Greenfield, and DeRosa. He leads them back to the mine to report the shipwreck and get help. With the bitter cold taking the last of his strength, William DeRosa dies on the way.
I had a picture of my wife in my locker, and I figured that if I had my life jacket and I put the picture of Joe in my life jacket pocket, that when they found my body, she would know that I must have thought of her at the last minute.
Back at the Truxtun, the rescuers attempt to launch a dory to reach the remaining survivors clamoring for a boat. Again and again, they fail. Adam Mullins, Howard Kelly, Charlie Pike, and Dave Edwards from the top of the pinnacle give it one last try.
When they first tried to lower the dory, the wind picked it up and threw it back at them.
The dory came down over the cliff, not from the side
Over
of
the
the
cliff,
ship. Right.
over the cliff now. The Newfoundlanders lowered the dory.
About 300 feet down.
Yeah, and when they first put it over the cliff, the wind was running so strong it threw it back. So they put a Newfoundlander in the bow and one on each side of it, and they lowered them 300 feet down, hanging there in midair on this dory to weight it down so they could get it down to the little beach. And then they rowed out to the ship, and I saw them coming. At that time, there were 4 of us still alive, and Jones was still alive, Peterman, and Mike Mulcairn, and Fitzgerald, and myself. And I told them, I said, there's a dory here, and they were so frozen, they were like out of it. And Mike just looked up and he says, "Dory, Mac?" And he says, "Keep fighting, Irish," and he just laid down. But he was still alive, and the Newfoundlanders threw me a line, and I secured it as best I could to the stanchion we were hanging on to. But then I took my concentration off the waves. The waves seemed to come at you in threes, and we were maybe, I don't know, a foot out of the water, 1.5 feet, 2 feet. hanging on the side, and they'd be coming over about 8 feet high and pick us up, slam us down, pick us up, slam us down, pick us up. They did that for 12 hours. It was getting so boring and bad. At one point, I says, all I have to do is close my eyes and I'm out of this. And I tried. I really tried to die, and I couldn't.
One fella off the Truxtun got in a wave, and that wave put him up halfway to that cliff on a ledge. That's where he landed, on this ledge. Now, how are you going to get him off that? So this fellow I'm talking about, Henry Lambert, his name was, he got a coil of rope, and he volunteered to go down, put the rope around his waist. He lowered him down, gradually. He finally got down, and he grabbed a piece of the cliff and hauled himself in where this fellow off the Truxtun was. And he was in bad shape. So anyway, he took the rope out of his own waist, tied it around the survivors. He pulled them up, right up to the top, right up. Then they lowered down the rope. He tied the rope around his waist, and they hoisted him up.
Henry was fearless, and he was out there like a spider. He was a real fit man, and he was as tough as nails, and he was out there like many other guys, I guess, but him in particular, like Spider-Man, hanging off the cliffs, fishing people out of the waters.
Parkinson was in line to be taken up along with the others, but he refused to go, and this astounded the rescuers. But he refused to go because he was the only connection between the shore and the rescuing point and the ship where the other signalman was.
Bo, as their communicator, became part of the rescue team, which was what he had been sent to the beach for. That was his job, right? So he was doing his job, and he became very much part of the team, and the Newfoundlanders considered him as such.
After the call comes into Lawn, 8 men head out for the grueling winter hike to Lawn Point. Just weeks later, Joe Manning would write a letter to his cousin, a first-hand account of the ordeal that night. Because it was hard for rescuers to talk about or relive the events, these bits of first-hand experience are treasures.
I shall tell you about the SS Pollux and what happened from the time we received the first report until we arrived home after assisting in the rescue of 137 lives. Tom Connors left to go first. My father harnessed up his horse and got that coil of rope, and then he followed on behind them, right? When he got this far, he looked out here, he still couldn't see a ship. There was still no ship, so they didn't know at that time really if there was still a ship ashore there or not. So my father left the road here, left the trail, and he walked directly out over this ridge. And when he got out here far enough where he could see beyond the point, he could see the ship that was ashore there. And at that point, he looked at it for a while. He said, if I was there on that cliff, I'd like for someone to come and help me.
Having lost nearly 100 sailors trying to swim to shore, those remaining on the Pollux know they'll have to find another way to connect the ship to the few men who've made it to the rocks. As the seas threaten to take the stern, Navigator Grindley takes another shot at getting a line to Dupuy on the ledge.
The Navigator went up on the flying bridge, took the mouthpiece of a talkie telephone, a light line that was a heaving, that you tied to a heaving line, swirled it over his head. When a wave hit, so it was, the boat went pendulumed over to the side. He threw it, and the guy on the rocks, frozen barefooted, and he pulled that in. Then another guy who had been thrown up on the rocks and still survived came and joined them, and gradually we tied another heavy line on it. They tied that to the rock, and we put a bosun chair on the line with a pulley and a block. And then one at a time, we went over on the bosun chair.
The shipwreck was actually right here on the western side of Lawn Point.
This would be the ledge down below us where 122, I think it was 122 sailors that were trapped. When you look down, if you could picture actually, this rock below us would be packed with people, and actually people were actually on the edge of the rocks.
Getting washed off,
getting
and
washed
there's more
off.
floating around there.
As the tide came in, the waves started to pick off a man here and there. Night came. This is 12 hours after we hit. And we all knew we were going to die. There was no way out. We couldn't get up the cliffs. We knew the sea was coming in.
They came over Long Point, and they found the men. They were on a ledge under the cliff. They couldn't get up. They couldn't move from where they were.
It was light when we landed on the ledge, but it was twilight. And within about an hour, it was black. And this crescent moon appeared from behind the cliff, maybe 20 degrees above the horizon. And I remember thinking, this is the last moon I will ever see. And not long after that, there was a shout, and the guy just behind me, because the tide had been rising all this time, and he was swept off, and I grabbed his hair, but it wasn't enough.
And they said when they got there and looked down over the cliff, they could see the bodies floating around in the water, right? Guys hanging on to the cliff and hanging on to the ledges and that there.
All of a sudden, we heard a voice saying, "Is anybody down there?" "Oh, you bet your fucking life, buddy. Who is it?" You know. And what it was a Newfoundland man.
It was now 5:20 p.m., and every place was a sheet of glitter. God alone knows how high it is, but we rigged a leading line from the bank down to the cliff, got our ropes down, and started hauling them up.
They were actually on the ledge. I think it was from probably noontime right up to supper time before the people of Long.
5:20, they finally got the rope down to them.
5:20, and in February you're looking at darkness at 5:30.
Just got the rope down in time, before darkness.
And a guy by the name of Sanford stood where the rope came down and stayed there the entire time, tying one man at a time with the rope. And one at a time, you could just see a figure going up this cliff.
By the time we had 3 up, it was closing in dark, and I took them to a little cop and told them that that was where they'd have to spend the night. The poor fellows, they thought I had to take them to the settlement, but I told them the others had to be hauled over the bank first.
Using sled boards as fuel, eventually all of the sailors would be crammed around the fire for warmth and comfort. A few would die there.
I stayed on the cliff until some more men arrived from St. Lawrence who were fitted with rubber clothes and took our place. At 2 a.m. we hauled the captain up, and I tell you, we were some glad, as our arms were just about torn from sockets and our backs were broken, and we were weak with hunger. I'm sure if we hadn't gotten those ropes over the cliff before dark, there wouldn't have been a man saved. One funny thing that Hank mentioned about it was that when he was pulled up, he was expecting to see these giants of men, right, you know, who were accomplishing this feat. And when he hauled it up, I think the first fellow he saw was my father, and he was shorter than me. And none of the others, I say, with the exception of Uncle Ann, was a big man, right? Bobby Jarvis was a heavy man, all right, but Uncle Jim was about the same as my father. Uncle Tom, much the same.
Mr.
Uncle Grant was a
Mr.
little bigger, but not much.
So a lot of small men.
Yeah, they're more like the Smurfs than giants, right?
Unfortunately, they went ashore, but luckily they went ashore in Newfoundland. You're talking harsh climates. Well, these men were the harshest of men. They grew up in these climates, so they knew what they were getting into. Nobody wanted to go out there. Nobody wanted to go to Long Point that night, but These were hardy men. These were the salt of the earth, and they did what they had to do.
They knew what they were getting into.
They knew what they were getting into before they went anywhere. Well, this was their first rescue ever. Right? They didn't do this on a weekly basis.
Right.
They didn't get trained in this. It was just, this is their life. And this was their first rescue ever, and most likely their last.
With all the rescuers pitching in, including some from Chambers Cove and eventually some from the Navy, it would be almost dawn before the last survivors could be taken by sled the several miles to the mine.
Main strength and dead ignorance. That would be the term he would have used. Not knowing any better, not having any more sense, rather than to get at it and get it done, right? You know, because it was a grueling, grueling night they put in there. They had no oil clothes, no rubber gear, and that salt spray and wind and sleet was just coming over them with every, you know, they were out on the cliffs trying to get those guys up, and the sea was just breaking on the rocks, and the spray was coming over them, and they were all soaking wet and freezing and everything else, but still they persevered, and they got it done.
The Navy, the sailors, I mean, they were all heroes, right? I mean, they did everything in their power, you know, to rescue their shipmates, right? There were many of them that died, you know, trying to rescue their shipmates, and that shouldn't be forgot about. And also, you know, they helped the locals quite a bit, you know. There was one story about a singleman on the Truxtun, Parkerson, who made it to shore and certainly stayed on the beach to single, you know, to the other singleman on Truxtun.
So all during the next 4 or 5 hours, Parkinson stood on the beach, and I was 20 feet away from him most of the time, and he was signaling to his buddy on the ship. And, you know, he was there, and he persisted in staying, and at the same time, people were saying to him, look, you can't go on like this, you have to. But he stayed and stayed.
After the last sailor had been pulled out of the water alive, then Bo got off the rock and went to the fire that Gus had kept burning, and was walking around with the others in the fire waiting their turns to go up the cliff. He was walking and he started to tremble and shake, and then he fell. And they rushed to him and tried to warm him up with blankets and cover him with blankets and get him warm, but it was too late. With his final breath, he said, he called out, "Mother," and then died. And that somebody found an oil-soaked American flag it was on the beach, and they covered him with that flag.
I don't think the U.S. Navy really recognized some of these men in a manner that they should have, and Bo Parkinson is a clear case. This is the beach where, you know, there's no way of describing, you know, the incidents that happened on that beach that indicated the not only the tenacity of the rescuers, but I mean the real heroism of these very young sailors who battled like hell to save their lives.
By noon that day, Navy coastal boats were surveying the shoreline, looking for ways to help by sea, but they failed to effect the much-needed rescue by land. Many of the survivors were left to wonder simply, where was the Navy?
I was on a minesweeper. We were the first ship to arrive that morning at daylight. Everything was done by the Newfoundlanders already. Anything that was able to be saved, they saved them. You know, we're only 72 miles from the naval base in Argentia. I know the sailors mentioned to me many times, you know, it seemed like their brethren, you know, were a little bit slow in coming to the rescue. They were certainly at this site here in Chamber Cove later in the day, and they were at Long Point. But they always wonder, you know, why did it take so long?
My mother, Ina Farrell at the time, she was the one that took the only surviving pictures of the whole rescue operations and the disaster.
Ina Farrell Edwards was a young woman when she got a Brownie camera that Christmas, just before the shipwrecks occurred. With an eye for history, she was able to take the only photos of the disaster and became history herself, keeping the story alive for decades to follow.
You must remember that all these pictures were taken with a little $5 Brownie. The first day I only got as far as Chamber Cove. They were still operating, and there was still rescuing going on at Lawn Point for the Pollux. But I couldn't make the two, and I was on skis. So by the time I got finished with the Chamber Cove at the Truxtun, it was too late in the evening to go over to the Pollux. So the next day I skied over to the Pollux, and I took the pictures over there. It was lucky that I did, because the following day she sank. And I guess because I was always interested in history in school, and I knew that that was really history in the making. So I said, well, it should be recorded. Somebody should be taking pictures of it, you know? And that's why I wanted to go out so badly to do that. So this day I went over, and they were all the Navy men now from the salvage party, and they're pulling this thing up the cliff, you know, by a rope. So when I went down with the camera to take some pictures, this real old huffy fellow says, "Get out of here! You're not supposed to be here shooting pictures with a camera." And I said, "Well, why?" I said, "I have all permission." I said, "I'm a reporter. I'm a reporter from the Globe and Mail." That's the first one that really occurred to me. So everything was grand. Then after that, he let me shoot away. So I said to one of the fellows, "Why is he so huffy?" And they said, "Well, actually, we're salvaging the decoder, and that is why that he didn't want anybody around." Commander McCaleb sent a couple of his men to me from the ship, and asked me if I would release the film. Well, I said, "I'm awfully sorry. You tell the commander I'm very sorry, but these are my films. I took the pictures, and I'm not releasing them."
But the only problem was, because it was wartime and it was all sensitive, and you didn't need Nazi Germany realizing that the U.S. had lost 2 warships through their own negligence up on the rocks on the east coast of North America, rather than by enemy action of some sort. That was why they wanted to confiscate those photographs.
Admiral Bristol from Argentia sent a special request that I release the film. Yeah, well, we know for censorship reasons, eh? So I said, "No, I'm not releasing my film. I just can't. I'm awfully sorry, but I just can't."
And as the years went by, she became famously known as the lady that said no to the U.S. Navy.
The women played just as an important role, and I mean, saved a lot of lives, right? With what they, you know, with what they had at the time.
Whoever had anything to help, because lots of people weren't rich back then. If you had 2 loaves of bread, you shared one.
The women of Newfoundland did not sit on the sidelines. When the call went out that there were survivors at Iron Springs Mine needing help, the women responded with blankets, food, clothing, whatever medicines they had, however they could get there. Among them, Clara Tarrant, Lot Malloy, and Ethel Giovannini and Lillian Loader, who 7 months pregnant at that time, took off on foot to help.
They took us to the mine shed, and there were women there, and they put hot rocks around us. They put us on the tables, and they tried watching the oil office, which felt like sandpaper. And I'm sure that most of us probably cried.
Most of these men had frostbitten feet. I mean, they were covered in crude oil. They were smoke blind. They were frozen. So it was hands-on hard work. And, you know, I'm sure that a lot of them would have perished if they didn't have that hands-on from the women in the community.
Lanier Phillips came too, with the caring hands of the local women trying to scrub the oil off his body. Most of the women had never seen a black man before him.
When I woke up, even the condition I was in, I realized this was something strange. And when they later said, oh, he has, look at this curly hair, this is the curliest hair I've ever seen, I said, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. I would not have been surprised if they said, get him out of here until we get all these white sails taken care of. I would not have been surprised because that's what I was used to all my life. I was used to that. So, and when they didn't do it, and then after they found out that I was a black man, the treatment was no different, maybe even better.
Noticed in talking to everybody, they all say the same thing, that all of a sudden it was like in the mind. It was like they were angels, more than human.
203 sailors died that day. 186 survivors were taken from the mines to local homes to be cared for by the families. People say every home had a sailor in the parlor.
The survivors, but from both, were in St. Lawrence homes for some time. And I remember after I went home that evening, there were two people in our house, and practically every house in St. Lawrence, because it wasn't, you know, a big population.
Miss Lillian Loader, that's my mother-in-law, she took James Seaman's, Mr. James Seaman's home to her house and cared for him that night. And she was fearful that night that he would die during the night.
We didn't have a lot to offer, but she gave him what she could. And, you know, clothes and a bath, of course. I don't know if we had bathtubs back then, but bathed him and fed him and took care of him. And she was the one that told the American government who came to take him that, no, you're not taking him, he's not well enough.
Well, she didn't want to let him go when the Navy came for him to leave, and he was emotional and didn't want, because in them few short days, they got attached, and there was an attachment, and I can remember her telling the story that morning when they came to pick him up, as he was going out the door, and I seem to remember he was on a stretcher maybe, and she said, Mr. Leo, her husband, we always called him Mr. Leo Loader, the last thing he did was take his hat off and put on James Seaman's head. So, and Mrs. Loader said she cried that day as like it was one of her own when he was leaving.
It was 10 years after 42, it was 52 when I was born, that I was baptized, of course, and she named me James after James Seaman. Yeah, I remember when a little boy, probably 5, 6, 7 years old, in the summer, we'd every now and then we'd receive a box from the States, and we all were very happy when it was open because it was all clothes that he sent us from his family. And the highlight was, of course, when you reached in the pockets if the pants fit you, and you found a dime or a nickel, American currency. You know, I come here quite often. I know that I got a connection with my mom and my dad, who was down that water. Yeah, and helped people out in the water, you know, and as you see, I get emotional when I talk about that. But, you know, that he did that, and I know I got a connection, you know, with the name, and so, you know, it's very important. It has shaped us in a way, for sure.
They had taken off their own gloves, had taken off sweaters, and put them on survivors. They were unbelievable people. They had taken such risks to save us.
When you talk about humanity and kindness and courage, it would have, you know, if it had to happen in any other little community in Newfoundland, it would have happened in the same way. You know, it's just the spirit and the love that's in the people of Newfoundland.
They didn't consider themselves heroes or anything like that. They just, it was the same as, you know, if you fell down and I went over and picked you up. Yeah. That's it, right? Beautiful people.
In 1988, 46 years later, the Truxtun and Pollux survivors were invited to come home to St. Lawrence and Lawn.
Every vehicle that could turn a wheel in this town was in that motorcade, headed out by the 2 fire trucks, 2 or 3 RCMP vehicles, and the town was lit from one end to the other in August with Christmas lights. And every man, woman, and child, from a 2-year-old to a 102-year-old, were all up waiting to greet the Americans, the survivors of 1942. And those people were just blown away. They had no idea. They didn't expect anything like that. You know, they were just common folk. They looked upon the people of St. Lawrence and Lyon as the heroes, but the people of St. Lawrence and Lyon looked upon them as the heroes. But to see all those guys get off of that bus at 2 o'clock in the morning, thick of fog in August, there wasn't a dry eye. It was so heart-rending. I'm choking up even talking about it now. Unless you were there, you never experienced something like that, right?
What did they say to you?
I said, my God, you've got white hair.
What have you got?
This is the most fabulous thing I've ever seen in my life.
Trucks, not the Pollux.
Oh, right. I was wondering if you were one of the people who was keeping me warm or one of the people that pulled me up the cliff.
Most of all, it was a chance to thank those who took them into their homes and changed them forever. Perhaps most transformed was young mess attendant Lanier Phillips, born and raised in rural Georgia and serving in a still racially divided Navy.
This is the house that they took me in that night. This house right over here. They took me in this house, and that's where I spent the night, in that night, Mrs. Haskell and Mrs. Pike. And after they got me cleaned up all the oil off and everything, after they found out they couldn't get all the black off. Not only did they clean me, but they fed me and put clothing on me and put me in their bed. I said, I've got to be dreaming. No Caucasian could ever do this for a black man. This is something I've waited 46 years to do.
Yeah. You must have been pretty young when you were
18. I was 18 years old, yes, young man. And it was just fascinating. And I feel that same warmth and love now in this community that I felt then.
Little did I think that I would ever see the guy that I did it for.
I have something here to refresh your memory.
If there were pleasure and joy that day, it was the sight of the people of Newfoundland standing on the top of the cliff, because they represented hope and truth. They were our salvation.
For the Truxtun survivors, it was retracing footsteps and a long look back at the cliffs of Chambers Cove.
Oh, shit.
This is more like it.
I think this is where...
This way you came up.
Was it?
Yeah. Oh, look, there's part of the ship. See it? See the iron down there?
The beam down there? Well, we must have been on those rocks over there then. That's the only way, yeah, because there should be a little beach right by these rocks here. It's so hard for me to visualize now with this all ice and snow that I actually did do it, you know?
And once I got to the top, right about here, I know it was here because the shack was to the right down there, and I saw that. And then I came back, and boats were stuck in there. And I didn't want to, it was all ice here, solid ice, and I yelled at him, and he said, go on, I can't make it, go on. And that's when I was lying there and reaching. I didn't want to get too close. I was feared that we both would go all the way back down. And I managed to get his hand and pull him up.
And I went straight out. That I know for sure.
A wave hit me and buried me, and I thought I'd never come to the surface. I was swimming forever, it seemed like, to come to the surface. They were so busy trying to keep the dory up, they didn't even know it. I swam to the dory, and I got that bar on the back, and I get in. They didn't even know I was in there. I'm sitting on the bottom looking at them, and they're fighting to keep the thing up. Then they hauled me up and put me on a one-horse sleigh, and I remember riding to the mine shack, and snow and ice kicking up my face from the horse, and the fellas riding the runners, and he's beating it, and he was really flying. And since this walk out here, I wonder how they ever found us. I can't believe that these people ever found us.
Oh, look at this, it's cloth in the oil embedded here. It's a T-shirt, a Navy skivvy shirt. Look at it. Look just like it happened yesterday. Look at it, 46 years.
The real heroes in that event, in my view, was a fellow named Bergeron, and who, you know, was responsible for saving practically anyone who was saved. Was a result of the fact that he made it up that cliff under the most difficult circumstances. No one ever knows, because not only was it a sheer cliff, but it was also covered with glitter. And how he made it up there, and then not too many people would find their way from there to the Iron Springs mine to begin with.
To point me in the right direction, it had to be somebody watching over us. There's no way you can look at it either way.
I'm really excited. I'd like to meet him. I always said I wished I could meet him, you know, before I died.
Are you Mr. Mike Turpin?
Yes, sir.
I'm Mr. Edwin Bergeron. Glad to meet you, sir.
Yes, sir.
I understand you was out there chopping away when you saw me walking across.
That's right, yeah. Come in.
Okay. All right, thank you, sir.
Hey, well, boy, I never ever thought I'd see you.
Well, I never thought I'd be back either,
Yeah.
to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate all you've done, too.
Yes, sir. Well, we didn't worry much over it last. We saved lives.
Yeah, you sure
But
did.
I can remember you coming across that mesh stuff. Yeah, I remember when I had to cut you like that, I put your hand up like that to help your line, carry you up and put you into the mine shack.
Okay. And then
the miners, I told them to ship ashore in the cove. You know
okay. I haven't changed that much, except I got a few more lines. I'm going to give you this picture, okay?
Yeah.
And this is a picture of me that was taken in 1942, about 3 weeks after the Truxtun, when I was on safe ground.
Yeah, well, thanks. And I was going to say, I'll give that to my son, and I'll get it taken off, a big one, you know?
Okay.
The Pollux survivors were taken by boat to Long Point, where even those many years later, raw and vivid memories returned.
So it was the waves that washed them off. So we were waiting up right along there, and then the rope came down there, and somewhere up there was kind of a crevasse with water in it.
It wasn't my time, that's all. That's the only thing I can say.
Scuba divers dove 60 feet down, retrieving Navy plates from where the Pollux lay below.
All of a sudden, I saw the two guys, black, covered with oil, standing on the end of the point. And I thought I was going to pass out until I realized that it was the two SEALs who had been underwater and had gone up on that same little ledge in their black suits that shone like the oil did. And then that was the only time it really came back to me like it was.
These are guys you grew up with, someone I went to school with. So, you know, you can't sorrow for somebody 46 years you only known for a couple of months. Guys you went out with dates with, and all our parties in New York, and our trips to Camp Smith. We were a close group. Yeah.
From St. Lawrence to Lawn, every rescuer, brother, sister, cousin, son, daughter, and grandchild wanted to meet a survivor. And the survivors couldn't offer enough thanks to each and every one. While many rescuers had suffered and died from miner's lung disease, some of the rescuers at Chambers Cove were still alive. But only one was left of the 8 who went to Lawn Point that night: Jimmy Drake.
From the Pollux. Mr. Drake, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
I'm glad to meet you, sir. Glad to meet you. Glad to see you today.
I'm glad you're seeing me today, too.
We don't our best.
I'll tell you, when we heard your voice up there and saw that rope first starting down, we had figured we had it. We were gone. There wasn't a prayer. And then you came out of nowhere, I guess. Did you see her on the rocks before you left here? How did you know she was on the rocks?
We went out and put away our horses for the night, that's what it was. Then when we went down, see, we couldn't bring you open. We went down on the bank and we brought you open the ship. Well, we see nobody, but we come up this way, and when we come up this way western, we brought you open in the gulch, and then he started to cheer.
You know what I don't understand? I remember you being about 8 feet tall. Right? I remember going down on a sled like this, with a little horse that had a lot of fur on it.
I'm his wife.
Yes.
And I thank you very much for saving his life.
Oh, God bless you, ma'am.
Thank you, thank you.
God bless you.
And if it weren't for him, I wouldn't have her. That's my daughter.
Right. That's it. Well, I'm pleased to meet you. Glad to meet you today. Glad to meet you. Proud to meet you.
Well, surely for those of us who were left on that February in '42, it was a rebirth. You wonderful people of St. Lawrence and Lawn made that rebirth possible. It is difficult to imagine good coming from tragedy, but for many of us survivors, it did.
At the time we were here, they didn't have running water. The streets weren't paved. They had thunder mugs under the bed, no sewage. And I've told many people over the years, I said, in material things, they've had not much, but I said they have everything. I said they're the richest people I ever met.
I think that is the nature of Newfoundlanders, mostly because you live by the sea, and which is a dangerous life. I mean, in every way you do it, if you have to make your living by it. I mean, you can't pick fine weather, I mean, for your efforts. You have to take, I mean, the bad weather with it, and it is a dangerous occupation, and possibly that's one of the reasons. On top of that, people who live in that type of environment are people with an emotion and a softness and a grand feeling for mankind and will go all the way out to help another. And I think this is what propelled them that day in their effort.
You see, it was such a traumatic event, and then afterwards having to live with seeing so many funerals, because for the first couple of weeks every sailor that was buried was put in a casket and given a proper burial. Flag over the casket, and the townsfolk turned out in their numbers and followed them to the burial ground.
The families and loved ones of sailors who lost their lives in Newfoundland were told little of how they died or what actually happened.
My name is Myron Schultz. I had a brother who was lost on the Pollux. I have all the articles and pictures out of the papers at that time. But I always wondered what really went on and what yous all went through at that time. All they told us, he was lost in this storm. His empty casket is buried next to my mother and dad.
The family was never told anything. The death certificate lists the cause of death as drowning, and that was all they ever knew. That the ship had sunk and he drowned. My grandparents have long since passed away, and of course, all of Beau's brothers and sisters have passed away, with the exception of my aunt Dorothy, who is still alive, and she's the only one that has ever learned the truth about what happened to him and what he did that day.
He was a hero.
He was a hero, yeah.
It was wartime, you know, and everything was secrecy, and very little information was known about what happened and how it happened or anything else. And many of the families who lost people, you know, were never well informed on the actual event and what happened and so on.
Because them ships never got bombed, they never got torpedoed, they never got mined. I mean, they went ashore in a storm because that admiral put all his feet in that newfangled radar, which was a brand new thing, and overrode them 3 navigators and all them 3 ships and sailed up in the rocks, right?
It was 30 miles off course, right? The ship was, if it had been 31 miles off course, it would have...
She would have went up there on this shoreline.
Would have gone up
there,
on this shoreline up
which
here,
is
right?
a lot lower, not anywhere near like this, right?
They probably could have all been saved.
With errors in navigation and communication and the unforgiving nature of the storm, the cost in lives and ships was steep. Blame had to be placed. The courts of inquiry focused on the flagship Wilkes, but also on the Pollux. Lieutenant Grindley of the Merchant Marine wondered when he'd get his chance to testify.
He got rumblings that around the Naval Yard, other regular naval officers were being reassigned. But none of the Merchant Marine personnel, of which there were a few on his ship, and apparently some on the Truxtun, were getting reassigned. So he made inquiries, and according to Dad, he found that they were preparing court-martials against some of the naval officers and all of the merchant officers.
The Navy needed its men back in action. The inquiries were terminated, and commanding officers on the Wilkes and the Pollux faced courts-martial, as did their navigators. When asked, the commander of the Pollux never said that Lieutenant Grindley alone had argued for a 90-degree change of course that night. That truth never came out.
The tragedy remained that they never withdrew the charges, so that they could still technically court-martial all of the Merchant Marine officers. They did court-martial a few of the regular naval officers, but the charges still remain.
There's issues with training and experience, you know, of some of the crew. I mean, the radio operator only had a few hours training. and a few days' experience. On the Wilkes, it was one issue after another that was just pushed aside, right? The one person that was really hit hard was the navigator of the Pollux. Why, I'll never know, but I mean, he was crucified, really.
He never got another bridge, being on the bridge position during the war, and that was pretty ugly.
From talking to, you know, survivors, everything that he did, had he been listened to, would have saved the Pollux, right?
It was a very traumatic experience for him. And, you know, as a officer of the deck, he's responsible for those men. And as a man who had captained merchant ships across the Atlantic, your first duty is to your crew and to your ship, and not to some senior officer in a ship that's already floating off the coast again. So he felt an enormous weight of responsibility, and that's, you know, that's the underlying reason that he did not talk about it. He felt in many ways it was his problem. He couldn't convince the captain, and he lost men.
Those Newfoundlanders who came out there and risked their lives to save these fellas, they were the real heroes.
As a thank you for their heroism and their deep humanity to the American sailors, a bill was presented and passed through Congress to build a hospital for the towns of Lawn and St. Lawrence.
One of the great things about the U.S. Memorial Hospital, because you know, even though the sailors and the fishermen and the miners saved the sailors, well, you know, 10 years into that hospital being there was a whole generation of men dying from the industrial disease. So, of course, when I graduated in 1970, there was 44 of us in the graduation class. There was 23 out of 44 kids that didn't have a dad, right? So that's when that hospital shined, right? Because that's where all of them seen the last light of day was in there.
February 24th, 1942. I have just learned of the magnificent and courageous work you rendered, and of the sacrifices you made in rescuing and caring for the personnel of the United States ships which grounded on your shores. I wish to express my most grateful appreciation of your heroic action, which is typical of the history of your proud seafaring community. Franklin D. Roosevelt.
When I think back over what my Uncle Jim did and my other uncles did and my dad and my grandmother and all of them, to me, they're heroes. And I wanted my kids to know the same as she wanted her kids to know. And so they grew up listening to it. Well, Uncle Jim did this and grandmother did that and so on.
Yeah, I knew the story from my pop and his dad. His dad worked in the mine, and he was one of the rescuers that went down there.
It's something that won't go away for a very long time because people keep telling it. And we're learning in schools now and everything and having big events for it. Like we celebrate every year on the anniversary.
Bound for to help the Allied cause and Hitler's grip to free. The mighty hand of Uncle Sam was welcomed heartedly. But now, of course, by 30 miles, the two ships blindly drove upon that stark, cold, merciless Long Point and Chambers Cove.
I was first told the story by my mom. It was her father, my pop, who actually sighted the ship at Weber's Point.
It's such like a celebrated thing in our town. Like we know so much about it, and we're very proud that we were the ones to be able to save them.
Yeah, like Jack said, there was lives at risk and everything, and someone had to step up, so I guess we did.
We took a field trip down to the Fisherman's Museum in Grand Bank, and they have the ladder from the Truxtun or the Pollux. I think it was the Truxtun.
No, I thought it was the Pollux. It was the Pollux.
It was the Pollux, yeah. They have the ladder down there. And I remember them saying it, and we were there, and we were saying everything about that. We knew all about it. We were
repping.
Yeah, we were repping.
I was there with Terry, and there was this man, big man, in the field with the sun, with a sight, sighting things. And I said, oh God, I need a shot of someone sighting. And I went up and I said, do you mind if I take your picture? He said, are you a tourist? And I said, no, I was on a shipwreck here. And he said, what ship? And I said, a ship called the Pollux, and they, oh my God. He dropped the sight, put both arms around them, and said, I was the lad that saw you. And it was the guy, now 40 years later, who had really been the one that enabled us to be saved.
They did more than save my life. This entire community showed me that, you know, that I was being treated as a human being and not as a black man.
The impact on your mind lasts a long, long time. 75 years is not long. Not long enough to forget it.
I went in to see if he was sleeping, and he's laying there on his back, and he's got tears in his eyes, you know. So I asked him, I said, what, are you homesick? He said, I was on a ship that went aground on a rock. And I was just thinking why I was left alive when so many of the others had to die.
It's tough, it's still tough. I went through the African invasion. I got hit on a can over in the Pacific. You think nothing of it. But this, you never get over. Never.
It was too bad that they're all gone now. And I think there's no joke in calling their generation the greatest generation. You know, and a lot of the guys that rescued, I mean, you know, we remember them as miners, but they were all seafarers before they went mining. The mines had only been here then for 9 years. They were all fishermen before that, right? So, I mean, in reality, it was sailors rescuing sailors, right? Yeah.